Welcome to my latest presentation, entitled Headwinds to Global Logistics Growth. My name's John Manners-Bell and I'm CEO of TI Insight. And in the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be discussing 10 trends which are set to impact on global supply chain growth in the next decade. I'd like to start my presentation by sharing with you the results of a survey which we undertook a couple of months ago at the height of the coronavirus crisis. As you can see from this graph, 45% of the sample size either strongly agreed or agreed with the statement coronavirus will lead to the end of globalization and the re-emergence of national/local supply chains. You must remember that this was at a time when PPE supply chains had failed and health authorities, hospitals all over the world were struggling to treat patients. No doubt if we held the same survey today, the results may be slightly different. However, I think it is very worthy of note that there was such a strong sentiment expressed by supply chain and logistics professionals, who after all have a very good understanding of the benefits brought by globalization over the past 3-4 decades or even longer. So let's move on to my next slide, when I will delve a little bit deeper into the relationship between economic growth and trade. Our chart here shows a dynamic which we've been talking about for the last 10 years or so. During the 1990s and for most of the 2000s, trade volumes grew at a rate which was roughly double that of GDP. Since the economic recession of 2008, the ratio between GDP and trade growth has been replaced with one of direct parity, so 1-to-1 or even less. In 2019, even before the onset of coronavirus, we can see that global GDP growth was 2.5%, whilst trade volumes had decreased by 0.1% that year. This changing dynamic has been caused by a number of reasons, including trade tensions and protectionism, most recently demonstrated by the US-China trade war, a reduction in import demand due to economic downturn in developed countries, decreasing wage differentials between developed and developing markets, changing investment priorities of countries which are focused on stimulating their domestic economies and their domestic infrastructure rather than exports, and the reduction in one-off gains from offshoring. Regarding this last point, many people believe that the peak of offshoring has already been reached, which means that future trade gains will be much reduced. Let's look at this last trend in more detail. According to the OECD, 70% of international trade is destined for production in global value chains. By value chain, I mean a supply chain in which intermediate goods are manufactured in a number of different countries before assembly and then export to the end-user consumer market. According to the OECD, fragmentation of production has already peaked, and this is put down to two of the points I mentioned in the previous slide: higher wages in developing countries, plus a focus on domestic investment. If we specifically look at China, there's been a significant reduction of what the OECD call backward linkages, as more input components of final products are being made in China. In other words, there has been a reduction of the import of intermediate goods, and at the same time as this, Chinese industry has managed to increase its forward participation by increasing the volume of intermediate goods it exports. If this trend continues, then the concept of Factory Asia will unravel, as China will reduce its reliance on imports from its neighbours and become a more dominant player in global value creation. This point is demonstrated by the two charts I have here. In the top chart, you can see that in 2005, over a quarter of exports from China relating to global value chains contained foreign content. By 2015, this had fallen to about 17%. Looking at the forward linkages, which is in the bottom chart, domestic value-added content in products exported from China to end-user markets in the rest of the world had increased from just below 58% in 2005 to over 64% in 2015. What does this mean in terms of logistics? Well, in very simple terms, it means that fewer intermediate products will be shipped from Asia countries to China, at least in relative terms. However, it will boost China's domestic logistics market. Let's now take a look at prospects for reshoring, an idea which has been high on many politicians' agenda for the last decade. I want to reference a particularly interesting study undertaken by the US Department of Commerce, which suggests that at present US manufacturers import 20% of their intermediate goods, compared with just 15% in 1997. This piece of work indicated that if offshoring was rolled back to the levels last seen in 1997, it would mean that the US would import around $180 billion less product. This would constitute a reduction in Chinese exports of 2.1%. In order to assess what this would mean to the international logistics sector related to the movement of goods from China to the US, we undertook a very quick and inexact exercise. Assuming that these costs comprise 5% of the total value of imports, this could amount to a hit of $9 billion to the logistics industry. My graphics on this slide characterize the thinking behind offshoring in the past. Typically, companies have unbundled and outsourced production to remote locations in order to benefit from lower labor costs, the capability to scale production, and the potential for lower inventory costs. This has been facilitated by low transport costs. In the future, companies will factor in many costs which to date have been invisible. These include economic risk, natural disasters, climate change, the geopolitical situation and security, corruption, business process risk, and in which I include also quotas and tariffs, cargo crime, societal risks and ethics, cybercrime, and of course, pandemics. If you add these costs to that of transport, then you are far more likely to find that reshoring becomes a more attractive option. Just how attractive I will deal with later in this presentation. Before I move off the subject of reshoring, I just want to talk a little bit about the impact which coronavirus may have on this particular trend. As I've already mentioned, the failure of China's production systems left the West exposed to shortages of PPE as well as other pharmaceutical products. This has given more impetus to the reshoring dynamic, as governments have promoted the repatriation of strategic manufacturing in order to assure the supply of essential goods. In the coming few years, we may see this trend consolidated by increased levels of protectionism, subsidy, and domestic investment in manufacturing. As my graphic here illustrates, governments are looking at three major options. Firstly, to develop local manufacturing capabilities. Secondly, to mitigate risk by reducing reliance on China as a manufacturing source by looking at China Plus options. And thirdly, to build up stockpiles at strategic locations. Although shortages of PPE were the original cause of these considerations, many governments are now looking at other sectors which will fall into the remit of an industrial strategy. However, there are drawbacks to each and every one of these options. Although this is not the place to go into a detailed discussion, I would just highlight that China still has overwhelming benefits in terms of cheap labour and has substantial capacity. Whereas local manufacturing in the West is based on high-value products and not suited to the production of low-cost goods. And then thirdly, if you are building up stockpiles at strategic locations, how much is required to be stored and who will pay the cost? As well as reshoring, a lot has been spoken of China Plus sourcing strategies, not least as a way to reduce supply chain risk, especially in the light of the PPE crisis. But it is not just all about risk. Rising wage costs in much of China and the present trade war between the US and China have driven shippers to look for alternatives. Whilst evidence of reshoring is often difficult to find, the results of China Plus strategies are far more evident. As you can see from the chart here, over the last 10 years, Bangladesh and Vietnam have enjoyed very strong growth rates relating to their clothing and textile exports, especially when compared with China. And if you look at the map below, it shows that fashion supply chains are now very nuanced. Although China remains the largest exporter of fashion products by far, many other fast sourcing options have been developed. In addition to these, you can see that there is a near sourcing belt which has been developed at the periphery of Europe. Relatively cheap labour rates and the proximity to the European market of these countries has helped the development of so-called fast fashion. I've already mentioned in this presentation the potential impact of trade tensions on international trade. In fact, the US-China trade war has already led to a major impact on trade over the last 2 years. Most of the tariffs imposed by the US have targeted the business-to-business sector rather than consumer, and hence global value chains have been the most affected. Intermediate products represent 57% of the total value of goods which now attract tariffs. Although part of the aim was to encourage reshoring and increase the level of US exports, we have seen a number of unintended consequences of this policy. Exports of goods affected by tariffs on inputs of intermediate components have dropped by 2%. US manufacturing output is down, and this was the case even before coronavirus took hold. US companies are now paying $46 billion in tariffs, which have directly caused job losses, again, even before coronavirus. And we have yet to see any evidence that China is purchasing more US goods, the aim of the Phase 1 trade deal back at the end of last year. What we can say, though, is that some other Asian countries have benefited from the trade war. The chart below shows that exports from Vietnam to the USA were up 35% in the first 9 months of 2019. In contrast, exports from China to the US were down by 13.4% in the same period. So we can say that protectionism is not necessarily leading to reshoring, but it has led to geographic supply chain diversification. Logistics companies need to be agile enough to respond to these changes. Let's now talk about another policy which has the potential of fundamentally changing the pattern of trade flows. That is, the Chinese government's Belt and Road Initiative. Over the last few years, China has invested more than $1 trillion in infrastructure projects, linking it to countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. By offering finance at very cheap rates, it has been able to extend its political influence. The area which the Belt and Road Initiative covers is equivalent to 55% of global GDP, 70% of the global population, and gives it influence in regions where 75% of known energy reserves are located. Perhaps the best known of the various initiatives is the Eurasian Land Bridge, but there are many other corridors which reach into Central Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indochina. One of the results of the Belt and Road Initiative is the development of China-centric supply chains. Raw materials flow into China from these resource-rich regions, whilst its finished goods flow back into these markets. However, in terms of logistics, many international operators find themselves locked out of contracts to move these goods, with the main beneficiaries being Chinese-based companies. To counter what is seen as a strategic threat, that is, the projection of China's soft power, the US has plans of its own to finance infrastructure projects in the region, but nowhere near the same scale. We've also recently seen India try to expand its own region of influence, and of course at the moment, Sino-Indian relations are at a very low point. However, even before the onset of the Belt and Road Initiative, trade throughout the Asian, African and Latin America region were growing due to China's need to suck in intermediates, as well as the effect of the growing Asian consumer markets. South-South flows, as they're known, expanded from just 6% of global trade in 1990 to now around a quarter of all flows. 52% of developing economies' trade is now conducted on a South-South basis. My next two slides are also tied up with strategic and political issues. The first of these I've called supply chain weaponization, and it relates to the high-tech sector. Rarely out of the news this year have been attempts to exclude Huawei and other Chinese high-tech manufacturers from the development of 5G networks. This has mostly been at the behest of the US government, as these companies have been regarded as an extension of China's military machine. Legislation passed by the US has already led to the de-Americanization of some Chinese high-tech supply chains, and now US regulators have banned their use of US semiconductor technology. All high-tech companies which source from Chinese manufacturers, especially those working in sensitive sectors, will have changes forced upon them. What are the supply chain implications for this? Well, there is a very real likelihood that companies in the high-tech sector will have to develop dual supply chains. Chinese manufacturers will have to use Chinese suppliers, and those based in countries where Chinese influence is very strong, or at least stronger than that of the US. Other global manufacturers, which want to continue selling into the US, will have to ensure that all Chinese components are eliminated from their products. As Liu Yangwei, chairman of Foxconn, commented, it will be one supply chain for China and those associated with it, and another for the US and all their friends. As you can see from the map here, for Huawei, this will mean some very big changes which are already underway. At the moment, it is the center of a highly globalized supply chain, but in the future, its supply chain will be indigenized. This raises many questions in terms of the speed and cost of progress of the rollout of 5G networks throughout the world, as Huawei is the world leader in this field. Non-Chinese companies just do not have its capabilities or indeed scale to fill the gap. My penultimate slide deals with another trend being initiated at a government level. I'm sure everyone listening to this presentation will have heard of circular supply chains, but you probably will have only come across this from a sustainability perspective. This is, of course, very important, but this trend is also being promoted from the angle of strategic autonomy. It fits very well with policies promoting reshoring, near-sourcing, and China Plus, otherwise known as optionalization. At present, many governments are very worried about the dependence of key industries and raw materials which can only be sourced from China. By promoting circularity, this not only means that fewer raw materials are required, hence the environmental benefits, but it also reduces this dependency. As I say on this slide, international trade volumes will inevitably reduce as a result of the increase of materials and products already in circulation. There is also a reduction in demand for new goods as asset intensity increases. And thirdly, another key aspect of circularity, second-hand products become much more widely acceptable. Yes, these all have environmental benefits, but importantly, they also increase strategic supply chain resilience, achieving a dual policy goal. And of course, any presentation on globalization must include the impact of automation and 3D printing. We've been talking about these trends for many years as they will reduce the importance of outsourcing to low-cost labour markets, especially those in Asia. Coronavirus may well accelerate this trend, as since the onset of the pandemic, many manufacturers now regard their labour force as a major risk. The crisis has meant that borrowing money has become even cheaper, and that there have been government incentives for capital investment, which will make automation even more attractive. As well as this, the trend towards e-commerce solutions will mean that the warehouse function will become even more intensive and a good fit for automation efficiencies. Counter to this, however, are the high levels of unemployment which are likely to depress costs of labour in the West in the short term, and the fact that many companies will have less money to invest in automation in any case. However, in the medium term, more manufacturers is likely to be reshored, and as a consequence, there will be fewer intercontinental movements of goods, at least in relative terms. So just to wrap up some of the key points from this short presentation, I believe there is a strong likelihood of dual supply chains developing, one centred on China, another on the US and its allies, perhaps even a third focused around Europe. Secondly, we are already seeing that China Plus strategies lead to strong growth of export volumes from smaller Asian economies. Thirdly, we are likely to see more reshoring, but I don't believe it will be on a mass scale due to a number of reasons. These include ongoing lower labour costs in Asia, the existence of developed production ecosystems and their expertise, ongoing low and stable shipping rates from the region, and the strong infrastructure which already exists in Asia. This contrasts with the lack of production and labour force scale, as well as know-how, in developed markets. Fourthly, China is attempting to extend its own influence throughout Asia and the rest of the world, not least through its Belt and Road Initiative. This will promote the development of China-centric supply chains as opposed to global supply chains. And generally, I believe that the future of supply chain organisation depends more than ever on political intervention by the US and China governments, and in the future, perhaps to a lesser extent, by the EU and India. What we are seeing is a very complex environment in which it is very difficult to point to the winners and losers. The sheer scale of Chinese manufacturing will be impossible to replace in the West. However, that is not to say there won't be significant reshoring or changes in sourcing habits over the next decade. President Trump has recently said that he wants to decouple the US economy from China. Although I believe it is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve this policy aim in full, it will still have significant implications for global supply chains over the next few years. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you found this presentation interesting. Thank you very much. If you'd like to find out more about some of the points which I've been talking about in this presentation, please feel free to get in contact with me using my email address, which is on this slide, or visit our website www.tiinsight.com.